Hey, welcome back, family. Pull up a chair, because I need to tell you about a state that Washington stopped watching, right at the exact moment it started to matter more than almost anywhere else in the country. There's an old rule in poker that the best players don't watch their own cards, they watch the table. They watch who suddenly gets quiet, who starts sweating a little around the collar, who folds a hand they had no business folding. And if you'd been watching the table in Ohio these last few weeks instead of the noisy stuff happening in Washington, you would have seen something Republicans really did not want you to see. A state that was supposed to be locked, boringly, permanently red, suddenly folding its hand in public. Not because of a poll, not because of a debate, because of something much messier. A scandal inside the family, a war nobody asked for, and a senator who came back from political exile to remind everyone exactly why he left in the first place. Now, I mention poker not because I have a gambling problem, but because Ohio Republicans currently have the look of a table full of people who thought they were holding a winning hand and have just started doing the math in their heads. Let's do that math together, because the causes here matter just as much as the consequences, and nobody in the mainstream coverage seems interested in connecting them. Start with the headline that should have been bigger than it was. Axios, a publication not exactly known for hysteria, described Ohio, a state Trump carried comfortably, a state Republicans have treated as a foregone conclusion for over a decade, as, and I'm paraphrasing loosely here because I try not to just read you other people's headlines, a red state suddenly turning into a genuine mess for the GOP. That's a remarkable sentence to have to write about Ohio in 2026. Ohio doesn't usually make anyone sweat. Ohio is supposed to be the state that quietly does what it's told and shows up in the electoral math as a number you don't have to think about. So when the word mess starts attaching itself to Ohio Republicans, of course, that's worth about 12 minutes of your time. Stick around. Here's where it gets genuinely dark, and I want to be careful with the language here because these are allegations, not convictions, and the difference matters even when the details are horrifying. Congressman Max Miller, a Republican from Ohio, is facing allegations from inside his own extended political family, no less, of domestic violence against the mother of his child. The allegations reported include scalding water being thrown, a broken collarbone, and, almost too disturbing to say out loud, a firearm allegedly pointed near their child. These are the kinds of allegations that would end most political careers within about 48 hours in any healthy political culture. Instead, Miller has said, more or less, that he's not going anywhere. He's staying in the race. He is, in his own words, not resigning and not backing down. The House Ethics Committee has announced it's opening an investigation, which Miller says he welcomes. And look, I'll give you the honest, unglamorous truth about House ethics investigations that nobody wants to hear. They take forever. They move at the speed of a DMV renewal filed by mail. So, I welcome the investigation is not exactly the profile and accountability it's being sold as. It's more like agreeing to a trial date scheduled for sometime after the next 3 election cycles. Now here's the detail that makes this a Trump story, and not just an Ohio story, because everything eventually is a Trump story if you follow the money and the loyalty far enough. The person calling loudest for Miller's resignation is Republican Senator Bernie Moreno, because it's his daughter making the allegations. And Bernie Moreno is only in the Senate at all because of one very specific, very deliberate decision Donald Trump made in 2024 to put his political weight, his endorsement, and a mountain of outside money behind Moreno in order to defeat the sitting senator, a man named Sherrod Brown, who had represented Ohio for the better part of 2 decades, which means the same political machine that manufactured Bernie Moreno's Senate seat is now the machine whose own family scandal is blowing up in a way that Democrats did not have to lift a single finger to cause. You cannot write a more uncomfortable irony than that if you tried, and believe me, I've tried. So, that's cause number 1, a homegrown GOP scandal that Trump's own king-making helped set the stage for, whether he intended it to or not. Because number 2 is where this stops being a local Ohio story and becomes unmistakably a referendum on Trump himself. Because sitting right next to the Miller scandal is a Senate race that Republicans were not supposed to have to worry about. Sherrod Brown, the man Bernie Moreno beat, the man who lost his seat largely because Trump and a historic wave of outside spending decided he needed to lose, is running again. And he is running against the man currently occupying what used to be his seat, John Husted, the appointed senator who inherited the position after J.D. Vance moved up to the vice presidency. Here's a thing about Sherrod Brown that even people who disagree with him tend to admit, sometimes through gritted teeth. The man does not quit, and he does not pretend to be something he isn't. He has spent his career being, by his own description, a nuisance to Wall Street. And there is something almost old-fashioned about a politician whose entire brand is, "I annoy powerful people on purpose." In a conversation I watched recently, Brown laid out, plainly, without much polish, exactly why he thinks Ohioans are furious right now. And it wasn't abstract. It was granular. Roughly 500,000 Ohioans are projected to lose health insurance coverage starting next year because of the tax and spending package Republicans passed and Husted supported. A bill so politically radioactive back home, apparently, that Husted quietly pulled a video off his own campaign website where he'd been bragging about voting for it. Rural hospitals are cutting maternity and mental health services. Some are closing outright. Veterans are absorbing cuts to benefits at the exact moment burn pit exposure, and other service-related conditions are finally, belatedly, being taken seriously. And there's a small business owner, an exterminator of all professions, someone who handles dangerous chemicals for a living, who had to drop his own health insurance after premiums more than doubled, because the promised cap on Affordable Care Act premiums never came, killed by votes Husted cast against it, according to Brown, something like 7, 8, 9 separate times. Of course, when a man who fumigates houses for a living can't afford his own health coverage, that tends to say more about the state of the country than any press release ever will. Now, let's talk about the war, because this is the part where Trump stops being a background character in the Ohio story and becomes the main event. Husted has, by Brown's count, voted more than a dozen times to keep funding and authorizing what's being described as an ongoing, undeclared conflict with Iran, a war that, and this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, nobody in the administration has particularly bothered to explain the actual objective of. Not the endpoint, not the exit. Just an open-ended commitment that keeps getting re-upped, vote after vote, with American service members, several from Ohio itself, according to reporting, among the dead. At one point, Husted reportedly said, in public, that the war was going better than most people expected, which is one of those sentences that means absolutely nothing, and yet somehow tells you everything, because a man who felt he had something real to say about that war would have said something specific. Instead, we got vibes, positive vibes, delivered with a straight face, about an active conflict with American casualties. I don't know exactly what going better than expected was supposed to mean, and I suspect he doesn't either, which is sort of the whole point. And this is where the money trail becomes impossible to ignore, because, of course, it always comes back to the money. A super PAC exists, apparently for the singular purpose of getting Husted re-elected, and it has taken in more than $220,000 from entities affiliated with Chevron and ExxonMobil. Big oil, in other words, funding the campaign of a senator who keeps voting to extend a Middle East conflict, while gas and diesel prices climb for everyone who isn't Chevron or ExxonMobil. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by pretending that's a coincidence, and to his credit, neither did Sherrod Brown when I asked him about it. He basically said the quiet part out loud. The profits are doubling, the money is flowing back into super PACs, and ordinary Ohioans are the ones paying an extra $1 or $2 a gallon to make that math work. Meanwhile, Brown himself is on the receiving end of what he says was already the most expensive Senate race in American history against him last cycle, and he fully expects that record to get broken again this time around, possibly by a Senate race in Texas, though I suspect Ohio Republicans would rather not be in that conversation at all. Then there's the story inside the story, the one that barely gets national attention because it sounds, on the surface, boring. Data centers. Stay with me, because this is not boring. This is one of the most quietly explosive issues in American politics right now, and almost nobody outside the affected states has clocked it yet. Ohio currently hosts around 240 data centers, tying it for fifth most in the entire country. and residential electricity rates in Ohio have climbed roughly 175% since 2005, rising according to federal energy data, nearly twice as fast as the national average and about 2.5 times faster than inflation. Husted, according to Brown, was the point man who delivered roughly $2.5 billion in tax incentives to bring these out-of-state data center corporations into Ohio. Incentives negotiated, in most cases, with essentially zero public input. Communities woke up one day with a data center consuming their water table and their farmland and pushing their electric bills skyward, and nobody had asked them a single question first. And this isn't even Husted's first rodeo with utility corruption in Ohio. He's been tied, as a witness rather than a defendant, to the fallout from what remains the largest political corruption scandal in Ohio history. A $61 million bribery scheme involving First Energy and the former Speaker of the Ohio House, in which Husted was reportedly close enough to the utility company to be nicknamed their Golden Boy. He hasn't been indicted. I want to be precise about that. But not indicted and not involved are two very different sentences, and only one of them is actually being claimed here. So let's put the whole picture on the table, because this is where causes turn into consequences, and where Trump stops being incidental to this story and becomes the through line of the entire thing. Trump spent political capital and campaign money to install Bernie Moreno in a Senate seat that used to belong to Sherrod Brown. Moreno's own family is now the source of one of the ugliest scandals in recent Ohio political history, involving a Republican congressman Trump's own party is struggling to disown. Trump's signature legislative achievement, the tax and spending package his own allies are now scrubbing from their websites, is stripping health coverage from 500,000 Ohioans. Trump's undeclared war with Iran is being kept alive, vote after vote, by a senator who can't articulate why, funded in part by oil money that profits directly from the war continuing. And Trump's broader deregulatory, corporate-friendly approach to energy policy has helped create the exact conditions: data centers with no local input, skyrocketing electricity bills, a state utility scandal with unresolved questions that are now radicalizing rural and suburban voters who used to be reliable Republican votes and, according to Brown, increasingly aren't anymore, regardless of their politics, because nobody likes watching their water table get sold out from under them without so much as a phone call. Here's what should genuinely worry the White House. If anyone over there is still capable of being worried about anything that isn't a cable news chyron, this isn't a coastal, college-educated backlash story. This is rural Ohio. This is small business exterminators and 80-year-old Vietnam veterans at the state fair, and farmers watching their water rights get quietly negotiated away. Sherrod Brown made a point of telling me that people across the political spectrum, Democrats, Republicans, independents, people who don't vote at all, are furious about the data center issue specifically because it's one of the rare topics that doesn't sort neatly along partisan lines. When you manage to unite rural conservatives and urban progressives in shared outrage over the same specific grievance, you have accidentally built the most dangerous kind of coalition there is, the kind that doesn't care what letter is next to your name on the ballot. Now, I could sit here and tell you this is a guaranteed Democratic pickup, and I'd be doing exactly what I criticize other commentators for doing, which is pretending certainty about something that is honestly still an open question. Brown himself, when I asked him whether he worries about being seen as yesterday's man in a fresh-blood political moment, gave an answer that I actually found more convincing than most political messaging I hear these days, because it wasn't really an answer about age at all. It was an answer about muscle memory. He pointed to the child tax credit expansion that dropped child poverty by roughly 40%, something he says he personally authored. He pointed to burn pit legislation for veterans. He pointed to the Social Security Fairness Act, the literal last vote he cast before losing his seat. His pitch isn't "I'm new." His pitch is, "I've already shown you exactly what I do with the job, so stop guessing." Whether Ohio voters find that more persuasive than whatever fresh-faced alternative gets floated by either party, we genuinely don't know yet. But I'll say this. In a political environment increasingly full of people promising what they'll do, there's something almost disorienting about a candidate whose entire argument is a receipt. And this, of course, is where Trump's usual playbook runs into a problem it doesn't have a good answer for. Trump's political brand has always depended on offense, on being the one attacking, the one defining the narrative, the one who never looks like he's playing defense. But you cannot go on offense against a domestic violence scandal involving your own senator's family. You cannot go on offense against electricity bills that have gone up 175% on your own party's watch. You cannot go on offense against an unexplained war with American casualties by simply insisting, with no elaboration, that it's going better than expected. Offense requires a target, and right now, in Ohio specifically, the target keeps turning out to be his own coalition. That's not a messaging problem you can solve with a rally. That's a structural problem, and structural problems, as I've said on this channel before about other countries entirely, do not unshift just because someone in Washington decides the optics have gotten inconvenient. So, where does this actually leave us, 20 minutes and one increasingly worried Ohio Republican Party later? It leaves us with a scandal that Trump's own political machine helped create the conditions for, a war that Trump's own allies can't explain or defend, and a healthcare and energy policy legacy that is actively radicalizing the exact voters Republicans need to hold on to in order to keep the Senate majority intact past 2026. It leaves us with Sherrod Brown, a man who lost his seat to Trump's money and Trump's endorsement, running to take it back, not on some abstract generational change message, but on the same unglamorous, receipt-driven, Wall Street annoying record he's had for 30 years, betting essentially that Ohio has had enough of the alternative to actually notice the difference this time. And it leaves us with Donald Trump, a man whose entire political identity is built on never appearing weak, watching a state he was handed as a foregone conclusion turn into the single most uncomfortable data point on the entire 2026 map. You have to admire the symmetry of it, in a strange way. Trump spent enormous effort and enormous money making sure Ohio stayed exactly where he wanted it. And in doing so, he built, piece by piece, without quite meaning to, the exact conditions that are now making Ohio the state Republicans least want anyone paying attention to. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, analysis from the edge. If you think this is the kind of story that deserves more attention than it's getting, subscribe now, because we're just getting started. And Ohio, as it turns out, was never actually the boring state everyone assumed it was.